This video is sponsored by Into the AM. Back in March, I made a video about understanding, and perhaps rationalizing, the narrative behind armor class and hit points in D&D. But something I wasn't expecting was how many commenters had the same method for explaining how hit points work, with the idea that adventurers, all adventurers, are just supernaturally different, more mighty than a normal human. Sure, we already make that assumption for some characters, like sorcerers get their magic from some power deep in their bloodline, so obviously they're inherently supernatural. But this theory proposes that every adventurer, even just your basic human champion fighter, is just better than an average person. That's why they became an adventurer, because they're stronger and tougher than other humans. They're all basically Steve Rogers. This isn't something I'd ever considered, and so we're going to talk about this theory today and see if it vibes with how you imagine your D&D games working. Because some of this comes down to flavor, and some comes down to the core fantasy of your game world. For example, do you explain your totem warrior barbarian resisting all non-psychic damage as a result of their sheer mental will, like mind over matter? Or do you imagine they're just supernaturally strong and tough? That's the kind of thing we're talking about today. That's why I wore this shirt. Actually, it's thematic, like the bear totem tattoos. And if you want to get this shirt for yourself and others like it, you can buy them from today's sponsor, Into the AM. Here's the thing, it's summer now, and I'm going to be sweaty more often. So when I'm choosing shirts in the morning, I literally have to choose between wearing a nice shirt that I just can't move around too much in or risk ruining it with sweat, or wearing a shirt that I'll be comfortable in, but that just doesn't look very good. But the shirts from Into the AM actually fit into both camps. I went to San Diego recently and wore Into the AM shirts pretty much every single day, and not only was I comfortable and cool, which is not normally my experience when wearing graphic tees out and about, but they also looked great. Visit intotheam.com/supergeek to save 10% off of these elevated everyday graphic tees. Once again, that's intotheam.com/supergeek. The link is in the description. Thank you so much to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. This theory that adventurers are inherently supernatural, just by default they're stronger and tougher than normal people, is one of those things that I hadn't really heard of, or at least I hadn't really noticed people suggesting, but then once people said it in the comments, I started seeing it everywhere. It's like how the first time you hear a word, you sometimes then hear it 3 more times in the next couple of days. I heard it in conversations on Twitter between popular TTRPG luminaries. I encountered it in discussions about the difference between 5e and other RPGs. Heck, for unrelated reasons, I was going back to some very early Matt Colville videos to do some research on older editions, and this topic came up there too. Specifically, Colville argued that the Greyhawk supplement sort of proposes this implicitly by describing how rogues can climb a, quote, nearly sheer surface, and how the fighter was patched by giving him extra strength options like better abilities to hit enemies, bust open doors, and carry more equipment. And you know what? Let's start with encumbrance. See, 5th edition establishes that a character's carrying capacity is 15 times their normal strength score in pounds. If a character has a strength of 10, which is considered the human average, that means they could carry 150 pounds of gear. That's the same as carrying about 18 gallons of water. So the current game proposes that a typical human can carry that much gear for an entire day of marching. And of course, the average level 1 fighter probably has a strength score somewhere between 15 to 18, which means they could carry anywhere from 225 to 270 pounds for an entire day. 250 pounds, by the way, the middle of those numbers, is about the same as carrying a giant panda on your back for 12 hours of marching. But if you want to add a touch more realism, you could use the variant rules for encumbrance, where your speed drops by 10 feet if you're carrying 5 times your strength score, and if you're carrying 10 times your strength score, your speed drops by 20 feet, and you've got disadvantage on a whole bunch of stuff. Now here's the thing, I don't personally view this as a great argument for adventurers being supernatural. 270 pounds is a lot, obviously, but it's clear that the designers just wanted a simple equation that could be a one-size-fits-all solution for encumbrance. In the real world, how much someone can carry is obviously dependent on a lot of factors. For example, my carrying capacity is very low because I have arthritis in my back. But also, this range is kind of vaguely realistic enough to be workable. There are some humans who can carry an incredible amount of weight. A study on Nepalese porters who accompany hikers in the Himalayas showed that on average these men carried 90% of their body weight, and a quarter of them carried 125% of their body weight. The men themselves weigh on average 100 to 140 pounds. So the minimum average is pretty easy to deduce. A Nepalese porter who weighs 100 pounds and carries 90% of their body weight can carry 90 pounds. That's still quite a lot of weight. The maximum we can determine from the data is way more intense. A Nepalese porter who weighs 140 pounds and carries 125% of their body weight could carry as much as 175 pounds, which is incredible, do not get me wrong, but we're also not quite at the number we get with 5e's formula. But that's because 5e is an abstraction, and a power fantasy. Players don't picture their characters as Sherpas carrying huge backpacks. They picture their characters as Hercules or Conan, Red Sonja, Wonder Woman, maybe Big Barda if you're nasty. Humans who are so mighty and tough they could be carved out of stone. But doesn't that mean that I'm arguing that they're inherently supernatural? Well, no, because that's meant to be the human extreme. These are characters with a strength of 18 to 20, which is the highest possible strength. Well, okay, some of the characters that I mentioned do actually have superhuman strength, but the physique that these characters embody is meant to represent a strength of 18 to 20, not 25, 30, whatever Wonder Woman would actually have. 50, maybe? Who knows? Remember the actor who played the Mountain on Game of Thrones? No, not that one. Not that one either. Yep, that's the one. Third time's the charm. I'm going to do a bad job pronouncing his name, so I'm not going to try, but before he joined Game of Thrones, he was a professional strongman, and he's generally considered to be the strongest man who has ever lived. And his record is deadlifting 772 pounds. That's like lifting a male and female lion at once. Okay, that's not a very useful thing to imagine. It turns out 750 pounds is a very challenging amount of weight for us to get our heads around. Now, of course, he's not carrying that on his back for 12 hours, but remember, the max your stat can be, naturally in D&D, is 20. He's been declared the strongest man on the planet, so unless he's secretly wearing gauntlets of ogre strength, then for our purposes we can assume that he's got the equivalent of a strength of 20. 15 times 20 is 300 pounds, and I think that we could all accept that this dude could probably carry 300 pounds on his back for a day of hiking. It might not be true, only he would know, but it's believable enough for our D&D game. Which is, of course, all these designers are looking for. Not a perfect representation of the real world, but just believable enough for a game. It's also worth noting that for a few playable ancestries, namely the Goliath, the Centaur, and the Bugbear, their carrying capacity is doubled, because for those ancestries, the design goal is to give the players a chance to play someone who is supernaturally strong. And by their inclusion, we can see that the designers are trying to offer that option for players, but that they don't expect that to be the default for the typical humans. But of course, 5th edition isn't the first edition of the game. Duh, right? But in that Greyhawk supplement we mentioned earlier, the numbers we got were a lot different. A fighter who rolled a strength of 18 had the option to roll a percentile die and get some bonus strength, which they could use to hit better, do more damage, open doors harder, and, most importantly for our purposes, carry more weight. At minimum, a fighter with an 18 strength could carry 500 pounds, the equivalent of a grand piano. At maximum, they could carry 1,200 pounds. That's the average weight of a moose. Do you know how big a moose is?
Fun fact about moose, they're the last surviving species of North American megafauna.
So is it possible that the idea that adventurers are inherently supernatural actually has nothing to do with the modern rules, but it's actually rooted in the history of the game before 5e? Well, before we answer that question, let's talk about hit points. After all, that's how this topic landed on my radar in the first place. Well, this is something we wrestled with in my last video, and I'm not going to repeat everything I said here. Go watch that video if you haven't already. But basically, one argument in favor of adventurers being inherently supernatural is how much damage they can take. This is one of the biggest things that sets games in the OSR apart from games like 5e. The whole selling point of a lot of OSR games is that you can never take as much punishment as you can in 5th edition. You're a normal person. So clearly the perspective of the designers of these OSR games is that 5e characters are way more powerful than normal humans. They might not be claiming that that was the design intent of the folks at Wizards of the Coast, but they're saying that this is effectively what D&D is conveying, whether deliberate or not. And depending how you feel about damage in D&D, I can see that argument. However, as I said in my hit points video, this depends on the tone of your game and how you describe damage. If you do want every hit to feel visceral, like an arrow or sword sinking into your flesh, then yeah, a normal human can't take as much damage as a 5e character can. But if you're like me and you describe these hits as more cinematic and less brutal, then it's not difficult to abstract things to the point where the damage taken doesn't necessarily need to represent a potentially lethal wound. But this just comes down to tone and your individual style. If you like grittier games where life is cheap and every hit matters, well, first of all, if that's true, then you probably already dropped 5e, or at least you're frustrated with the system, and you should really try an OSR game. It might be what you're looking for. But of course, if that's the style of game you enjoy, then I can absolutely see how you would look at the damage characters in 5e can take, and you're potentially forced to conclude that these heroes must be supernatural. Now, that's not a sentiment that I share. Like I said, I can narrate damage in a way where this doesn't cause any cognitive dissonance. But I do run into a version of this dilemma at higher levels, because as characters level up, they start being able to withstand damage that used to be able to kill them. And it can be really hard to just flavor your descriptions in a way that justifies that. If you're operating under the assumption that player characters are all superheroes by default, then this isn't an issue the way it is in my games. And since I don't play that way, then when this issue does arise at higher levels, as it always does, I don't really have a solution that I'm happy with. Thankfully, most D&D games fall apart before we ever get high enough level for it to be an issue, but still, it requires some mental gymnastics to make these fights believable when a character can survive a dragon bite, especially when they used to be able to be killed by a couple of goblin arrows. Now, there's another argument in favor of D&D heroes being superhuman by default that, frankly, is really hard to deny, and that's the fact that, in 5th edition, you heal all damage on a long rest. And honestly, that is pure fantasy. Now, like before, this does depend on how you describe damage, but if a hit was significant enough to knock a character unconscious, you probably do want to make it meaningful. You want to put some stank on it. And yet, even if the character receives no magical healing, they'll wake up after 1d4 plus 1 hours and have 1 hit point. Okay, fine, we don't want our friends to sit out the rest of the game, but then if they take a long rest after that, they'll be back up to full. You may have wanted to flavor it where the hit that knocked them out was actually meaningful in some way. It was a spear to the leg or a dagger to the gut, and they need more time to recover. Well, too bad. Take it up with Wizards of the Coast, because heroes always recover all their hit points after a long rest. No strike from an enemy weapon can have that level of impact in 5th edition. This is also something most OSR games change. In those games, you regain hit points more slowly. This is also true for older editions of D&D. That's why some spells are written the way they are, and part of why certain assumptions were made about how often heroes would return to town to get magical healing. And there is an optional rule for 5e called Gritty Realism that makes a long rest take a week. I haven't played with it, but the appeal is clear. It makes healing matter, which makes the damage your characters take feel more realistic. Now, I mentioned earlier that carrying capacity is just an abstraction, and in fact, that's what all these rules are. And that's okay. All role-playing games have to figure out which aspects of the fictional world are worth gamifying, like how your character attacks and deals damage, which parts of the fictional world are worth hand-waving away, like how often your character poops, and which ones land somewhere in the middle, represented by a game mechanic, but not really in a way that perfectly captures reality. In my opinion, that's true for some of the mechanics we've talked about today. Hit points don't really make any literal sense, but they're required so that players can have the sorts of fights that the D&D designers have in mind, where it takes more than just a single hit to knock you out. Gaining all of your hit points back on a long rest is a ridiculous dream, but it fits with how the designers intend for you to interact with the game world. Carrying capacity is basically an afterthought on the part of the designers. Encumbrance itself may be an optional rule, but even in most 5e groups, the concept of a carrying capacity at all is practically house ruled out of the game. And different systems have different approaches. For example, I honestly wouldn't mind a game system that took carrying capacity seriously, and where you had to track items and their weight. Although a digital tool set would certainly make that work a lot easier. But for a lot of people, that sounds miserable. That's why so many OSR games handle your inventory through item slots. Rather than allowing you to carry as many items as you want up to a certain weight, these systems give you a limit on how many items you can carry regardless of what they each are, what they weigh, and how much space they take up. That's another abstraction, and one that we know really doesn't capture the reality of the secondary world, but it's also objectively a much more elegant design, precisely because it severely cuts back on the bookkeeping required by the player. So maybe the issue here is that we're taking these abstractions, designed by people who probably don't have a lot of experience getting stabbed by goblins or carrying packs full of adventuring gear across the land, and we're taking these designs literally. That's not to say that this is a pointless exercise, but I just don't think that's how these systems are designed. I know Matt Colville argued in his video that the Greyhawk supplement was basically trying to imply that all heroes, regardless of their class or their ancestry, were basically superheroes. But whether that's true or not for the designers of Greyhawk and of the earliest editions of D&D, I just don't think that's the case for 5e. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people still look at games like 5th edition and see a system where the heroes are larger than life, and they're able to do things that would be impossible for a normal human. But here's the thing. Depending on who they are, this is either a bug or a feature. Some people who say this mean it as a criticism of 5e. For others, it's part of what appeals to them about the game. This question is about more than just how the game presents itself. It's about what you're looking for from the game. For example, in the fourth Die Hard film, John McClane surfs on the back of a jet. And people hated that, because that wasn't what people wanted from the franchise. They liked that the movies featured a scrappy underdog who seemed to actually get hurt, and had to keep pushing forward despite that. Same goes with Indiana Jones. He survives a nuclear explosion by riding inside of a fridge, and that was absolutely ridiculous. But it was especially frustrating because Indy was always meant to be a regular guy. Even though I don't personally think that either of these stunts are really any more unbelievable than some of the stunts in earlier films, that's not really the point. The point was, this broke the fantasy of what people wanted from those franchises. However, there are other franchises where part of the fun is that the main characters are unkillable demigods. James Bond, Batman, The Matrix, the DCEU, and of course, Fast and Furious. My point here is this. Whether you think of D&D characters as inherently supernatural or not, I think your feelings on this matter speak to the experience you're hoping to have with the game. While I've mentioned that I've found workarounds to hand-wave some of the superhero-iness of 5e, the reason I do that is because I personally find the fun in D&D when a character is not a remarkable hero from Jump Street. I like it when characters start as relative nobodies and have to gain skill and power as they navigate the world. But other players just want to fight through awesome scenarios and feel powerful. And to be clear, these are both power fantasies. Yes, obviously being a badass dragon slayer at only level 2 or 3 is a form of wish fulfillment, that's pretty clear. But so is the idea that a character could start as basically some random chump with a sword or a spellbook, and go on to gain notoriety and power and the ability to stop time or punch a god, or even just the authority to command armies and make a king bend the knee. You know how some people like playing all sorts of colorful ancestries and others just like playing humans? And the ones who always like to play whatever new creatures just came out and whatever new supplement just got released will never understand why other players like playing humans, because they have to be humans every day of their real life, so they just want a form of escapism? This is basically the same phenomenon. Some people like to play humans for the same reason some people don't like the idea that D&D characters are inherently just better than normal people. Because the fun for them comes from playing the underdog, playing somebody who nobody expects anything from, and then who perhaps winds up making a mark on the world. But likewise, and if you're somebody who doesn't understand why someone would enjoy 5e, you should pay attention to this part of the video. Some people do like playing characters who are just better than other people, and 5e kinda lets players do both. The early levels are still pretty lethal compared to, the rest of the game, but then pretty quickly you get to gain power and become an awesome badass. And the early levels are just dangerous enough that you can probably hand-wave things and say that the player characters are basically just ordinary people. And if you have trouble doing that because of the core assumptions of the game, there are a number of optional rules and third-party supplements to help you capture that fantasy while still playing the core game. Also, it has to be said, some players and DMs have never thought about this and they don't care one way or the other. And that's fine too. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it made you think. Obviously, this is a topic with a lot of different facets to it, and I cannot imagine that I've possibly covered every single one of them. So let me know in the comments if there's anything else on this topic that you'd like to see me add to or expand on. Maybe you've got a perspective on this subject that I haven't even considered. And if that's the case, I would love to hear about it. If you want to support this channel, there are a few terrific ways to do that. The first is the easiest. Subscribe and ring the bell. I make new videos every Monday and Thursday, so if you subscribe, you can get as much as an hour of free content every week. If you want to support me financially, you can join my Patreon. This video was voted on by my $15 patrons. If you want to vote in the polls and help decide on the topics for upcoming videos, come join my Patreon at the Fabricate tier. If supporting me financially isn't in the cards for you right now, no worries. You are always welcome to join my Discord server and hang out with other awesome people. Make sure to follow me on Twitch to catch my live streams, and sign up for my newsletter to get the, occasional email updates about whatever I have going on. If you haven't seen my video about rationalizing hit points and armor class in D&D, check that one out right here. Until next time, play fair and have fun.